Thank you, Ruth, for setting the recording. So just a couple of things. So Ruth is going to add a basic anthro definition in the chat for those of you who may not have a understanding of militarization yet, or who are maybe new to this sort of work. So Ruth, can you go ahead and add that for me? Fantastic. So I'm going to start off with one of the countries that disappoint me the most, the US. The US Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer and emitter of fossil fuels in the world. I can hear you all collectively boo, or I'm imagining it. Nika will talk a lot more about some of this work that she's been doing. So you'll hear a little bit more in detail about the US and the UK in particular. And the British military industrial sector isn't too far behind. The British sector has an annual carbon footprint of more than 60 smaller size countries. And recent estimates suggest that military emissions account for more than 5% of total global emissions. This means that if the world's militaries were a country, its national carbon footprint would be bigger than Russia's. Still, there's a huge gap in military emissions data as militaries remain exempt from country carbon reporting mechanisms, including the UN. So in this panel, what we're going to talk about a little bit are the intersections, or the why militarization is an important factor to consider when we are talking about the climate crisis. And we're also going to talk briefly about what people who either come from an academic or activist or even policymaker background can do to start addressing these issues within their own communities or globally. So what do we do with these horrible statistics? Hopefully our speakers, who come from vastly different backgrounds and experiences, can provide us some insights. So like I said, kept it really short and sweet. Now I'm going to ask my fantastic colleague Alwande to introduce herself, and then she will be introducing our panelists.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dee. It's great to be here with you all, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to diving into this discussion. By way of introduction, my name is Alwande Kumalo. I am the social media campaigner and project associate for Corruption Tracker, also an Amnesty International Global Youth Collective rep, a Black intersectional feminist, and a pretty hopeful being. It varies. So it gives me really, really great pleasure to have this conversation with you all today, and to co-welcome you all with the awesome Corruption Tracker team and the rest of the panel. So before we jump into anything else, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Nico Edwards. Nico, thank you so much for joining this discussion. It's really great to have you. Just a little bit about Nico, who is very, very experienced in this field. Nico is currently an international relations PhD candidate at the University of Sussex. Her research centers on exploring the rise of green militarism and sustainable warfare models across the global north. Simultaneously, she also volunteers as a civil society communicator, as well as coordinator, addressing issues around disarmament, demilitarization, and environmental sustainability. Nico does this work with a range of organizations, including Youth Fusion, the Abolition 2000 Youth Network, and Scientists for Global Responsibility. Nico is also a World Peace Foundation Research Associate, where she investigates emerging green military trends as part of the revitalizing debates on global arms trade program. Nico, it was a lot, and it's really awesome to have you here. So it gives me great pleasure to pass on to you. Thanks
so much. Let's see if I can share my screen to begin with. Voila. Can we all see this?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much to Bia and Alwande and to my fellow panelists, and hello to everyone who's tuning in. I would like to begin today's conversation with a question. Can war be environmentally sustainable? Most of you, I'm hoping, might think that this question goes without answering. or if there is an answer, it's surely no. When I first myself heard of environmentally friendly weapons, it indeed struck me as a mind-boggling paradox to place environmental care next to the means of war. Yet somehow, as we can see in this picture, we are. To policymakers, think tanks, and military staff across Europe and North America, this is not a rhetorical question. Before examining what this military greening looks like, or what I in my PhD research is considering as a form of green militarism, I'd like to look at how militarism and war are linked with environmental crisis. The most obvious links concern the direct destruction of natural areas, ecosystems, and habitats, or harm to environmentally sensitive sites like fossil fuel power stations in war zones. Another link that is finally receiving widespread attention concerns the greenhouse gas emissions generated across the full life cycle of military practice and armed conflict. The contributor I'd like to pay a little extra attention to, however, comes from the toxicity and radioactivity generated especially by unconventional weapon systems, like the weaponized chemicals and defoliants used in the Vietnam War, which are the ones we can see in this image, or nuclear and depleted uranium weapons. Because once reaching soils, food chains, and groundwater, or when being ingested by humans and animals, the radioactivity or toxins from these weapons stay there for what to us feels like forever, causing genetic breakdown and terminal illnesses long after a war's official end. These weapons thus have abhorrent transgenerational consequences for the environments, people, and non-human worlds in the war zones where they are used, but also at home where they are developed and tested, or among the communities where military minerals like uranium are mined, most commonly in the global south. How is this relevant then to today's discussion? Well, it should raise an eyebrow or two that side by side with their military greening agendas, the US and the UK are re-centralizing the role of nuclear weapons in their national security doctrines. The UK has even increased the number of nuclear warheads that the nation is allowed in stockpile, and is also currently on track to send depleted uranium ammunition to the Ukrainian army. Both these governments continue to call depleted uranium a safe conventional weapon, despite confirmation that it causes indiscriminate environmental and humanitarian harm for whole generations of civilians and soldiers and their families. And governments like the UK and the US have a long track record of systematically withholding knowledge of the carbon costs of their wars and military activities, or the severe dangers from the production and use of both conventional and unconventional weapons. And I'm drawing your attention to these doctrines' obscured long-term harm to help you think critically about what is really going on behind the scenes as military sectors are now positioning themselves as partners to the green transition. Let's look at what this looked like in practice. Since 2020, we've seen a proliferation of military climate action plans across Europe and North America. And there is a clear red thread running through these agendas as they define and fix climate change as a security issue, no? As a threat multiplier or a hyper threat with grave geostrategic and national security implications. This corresponds well with the climate and environmental security narratives that have dominated policy approaches to climate change in recent years. These narratives effectively reduce thinking and action around environmental crisis to a concern with the security implications of climate and environmental change. This framing, in turn, makes it possible for defense departments and military institutions to position the military as a necessary actor in an inevitable war on climate change and promote military security doctrines and military industrial solutions as a natural responses to the global insecurities and conflicts that are assumed to spread with worsening environmental conditions. And what is particularly striking about these agendas is how they take for granted dystopian worst-case scenario understandings of climate change, like the quote that we can see in this picture, and of societies and people's assumed inability to respond to environmental insecurities in non-violent ways. This then normalizes the military's response as one based on adapting to and preparing for these scenarios, rather than putting all our might towards preventing them from becoming true. And to me, what's even more interesting about the agendas is how they promote the military sector itself as an indispensable driver of climate action and a frontline player in the green transition. And this, to make this narrative credible, defense ministries and armed forces rely heavily on a close collaboration with the military industry to indeed drive research and production of green military technologies that are meant to reduce the military's reliance on fossil fuels and decrease pollution from weaponry and warfighting. And these initiatives include stuff like powering fighter jets and Navy vessels with cooking oil and algae, or developing everything from low carbon laser or microwave system weapons to biodegradable explosives, lead-free bullets, solar powered drones and submarines, lithium ion battery tanks, toxin reduced rockets, and solutions for turning waste explosives into compost. And this co-option of environmental sustainability by military actors is made painfully clear in the rhetoric used by the Aerospace and Defense Industries Association of Europe, who define military security as inextricable from sustainability, to then argue that through helping to ensure security, the European arms industry de facto makes a vital contribution to a more sustainable world. Ultimately, this green turn in military policy communicates a simple message, that there is such a thing as environmentally sustainable warfare and environmentally friendly weapons. Evidently, there's a lot of money to be made from selling this idea. Needless to say, however, the military has to cut emissions and make progress towards greener options for any of these nations to meet their climate commitments. However, the agendas make clear that these military sectors will only work towards climate action as long as this helps maintain or boost their military superiority. Through presenting war as greenable, it becomes possible to also present climate action and environmental care as compatible with military practice. It also makes it possible for the military to promote itself as going green without being challenged on the fact that it is doing so only as far as a greener practice allows these nations to become better at war, not to save the planet. What then does this all mean for climate and environmental justice? What we're witnessing, at least to my mind, is the creation of a powerful myth that the military sector can utilize to undermine climate justice arguments that view the military as the primary culprit behind ecological crisis. Together, climate security policies and military sustainability agendas silence and rule out non-military responses that acknowledge that environmental crisis cannot be resolved by investing in more weapons or militarizing new geostrategic risk zones like the Arctic, but that rather needs to be addressed holistically and multilaterally as a non-military challenge. So the kind of green militarism that we now see emerging is particularly harmful to just transition movements who view disarmament and demilitarization as necessary aspects of tackling the climate emergency. To conclude, how can we resist the militarization of environmental crisis? One obvious way that brings us all together today is to work towards demilitarization and climate justice as a joint cause. And I, like many of my peers in the peace movement, woke up very late to the issue of climate change and environmental sustainability and their links with war and militarism. At present, however, we're witnessing a veritable boom in advocacy campaigns addressing these links. And a wide range of organizations are raising noise at each UN climate conference and run powerful campaigns like No War, No Warming, or from warheads to windmills, with many others. And together they make creative connections between disarmament and climate justice. For instance, through highlighting the casualties from war and militarism's hidden environmental costs that no one accounts for, or through calling for international law to protect the environment during armed conflict, or raising awareness around military spending as a driver of climate action, and suggesting how, for instance, nuclear weapons and arms industry divestment campaigns can directly benefit climate financing. And with these promising examples of movement building in mind, I'm excited to leave the floor to my fellow panelists. Thank you. Back to you, Alwanda.
Thank you so much, Nico. That was really informative. It's graphically appealing. There's a lot to think about there. Please, if you have any questions for any of the participants, please feel free to share them in the chat. But we will have a Q&A session at the end of the session if you'd rather verbalize it. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is a South African climate action activist and intersectional feminist, Raisa Noor Mohammed. Raisa is a 20-year-old intersectional activist from South Africa. They began their activism in 2019, doing performance art pieces to raise awareness about the climate crisis. In 2020, Raisa stood outside their school gates every single Friday, boycotting class to demand that the governments declare a climate emergency and continue this boycott until the COVID-19 lockdown was implemented. Raisa has been networking and collaborating with activists and organizations, both in the country and around the world. And in 2021, Raisa crowdfunded to attend COP26. And in 2022, they attended a climate justice camp with almost 400 participants from 65 countries. They are in their current year of their undergraduate degree at the University of Cape Town, where they major in environmental and geographical studies, theatre, and anthropology. Raisa plans to combine their passion for social justice with their love for arts. Raisa, what an absolute honor to be with you and to be learning from you today. On to you, Raisa.
Hello. Yeah, so Alwanda said my name is Raisa Noor Mohammed, and I am a youth activist. I think we can go to the next slide. So yeah, I think Alwanda basically covered this part of my presentation. Who am I? Thank you. But yeah, no, I think I just want to talk about why I'm an intersectional activist, and it's because I believe that everything is connected, and the roots of the climate crisis are connected to the roots of many other problems like poverty, like racism, like inequalities. And those roots are tied to colonialism and industrialization and capitalism. And so I believe that in order to look for solutions, we need to look at everything together so that nothing and no one is left behind. So let's talk a bit about the climate crisis. So as I'm sure we all know, we're currently facing a climate emergency, and this is a result of human actions, human exploitation, capitalism, colonialism, industrialization. And I feel like it's very important to mention that it's a result of the exploitation of the West's exploitation of the global South. And so the causes of the climate crisis and people who are affected are on different levels and different scales. I think it's very important to acknowledge that it's not the same. And since humans started doing agriculture, global greenhouse gas emissions started changing and temperatures started rising. But of course, at that point, it wasn't at the scale it is now. With the Industrial Revolution and mass industrialization and capitalism, greenhouse gas emissions have been getting higher and higher, and every year we've been hitting new record highs. And the climate crisis causes environmental degradation, natural disasters, and weather extremes. And the climate disasters cause social, environmental, and economic disasters as well. And that it leads to resource shortages, and that can lead to conflict and disruption. And so beyond sea levels rising and melting glaciers and extinction of species and burning forests, there are so many knock-on effects of the climate crisis. And so before I look at how militaries affect the climate crisis, I want to look at why they care about climate change. And so with such disturbance and conflict, with such disturbances, there's chance for conflict, as we know with resource shortages. As countries face resource shortages, they're going to start fighting for resources, and that causes conflict. And we have existing conflicts, like in Syria. If we look at Palestine, there's existing conflict that also is affected by the climate crisis, because it makes the conditions more unstable. And when I was doing research, I found a website called Climate Security 101 that says that climate change poses a risk to 3 elements of military effectiveness, which is readiness, operations, and strategy. And readiness is basically the ability of the military to react. And so with the climate crisis and instability, militaries generally, militaries have really high budgets, and so they're pretty up to date with their weapons and their technology and their infrastructure. And with the climate crisis and with unstable conditions, this can affect their technology, and this can affect their ability to react in a timely manner. It affects their operations because, one example is placing burdens on supply chains. And this means that the things that military demands, and we know that military generally, when they demand something, they are prioritized, they get it. And so when they demand things with resource shortages and stuff, they wouldn't get it, and so that would affect their operations. And this also affects their strategy, because with strategies, when you plan out strategies, it's usually with the idea that it's going to be in certain conditions. You plan for certain conditions, and when things are unpredictable, this can affect your plans. And we can go to the next one. Now, how the military affects the climate crisis. So the military isn't just caring about something that is happening to them. They also play a part in the climate crisis. Military takes up a lot of money, takes up a lot of expenses. Like if we look at the US, it's crazy. I've been seeing on Twitter a lot of people talking about just the the police, or like the police expenditure, because that's been a huge discourse about police. But the military also takes up a lot, and I'm sure this is quite outdated information, and now it would be different. But in 2020, the expenditure in the US was almost 2 trillion. And if we look at, and if we think about climate change, and if we think about vulnerability, this money could be going to reducing the vulnerability of people to climate change. It could go into resources and housing and access to education and healthcare. And so in this way, by the military sucking out those resources, it results in other people being vulnerable. And like I said, with intersectionality, these things are very much connected. And when I was doing research, I found that on a website, they said that with such massive expenditure, military should be included in strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and look at the way they do things and where they get their supplies. And arms is a big thing, the military, weapons, and I feel like weapons are a big part of what they do. And it's not environmentally friendly, but beyond being environmentally unfriendly, it's exploitative. It takes, the resources it needs comes from global South countries, and that in turn creates vulnerability in those countries. And then the waste and the disposal creates pollution, and then military experiments and military things like bombings, and I know they do lots of weird experiments with nuclear and everything, and that definitely does something to the environment. So that's military's contribution. But we could talk about how militaries could be green, but me as a young Gen Z radical, I want to look at the concept of green militaries. So we can go to the next one. So we know that climate justice. You can't have climate justice without social justice. And our green militaries really a solution. If we look at the fossil fuel industry, it's an exploitative industry. And if we just look at going to renewables instead of also like digging down, looking at the roots, we just switch, it could still be exploitative, but just in a green way. So if we apply this to military and war damages ecosystems, it damages societies, it causes displacement and death, loss of lives, and it massively impacts supply chains and resources. And beyond affecting the climate crisis, they cause massive disruptions in society. Militaries, with the pollution, and they cause pollution and everything, but beyond that, they heavily disrupt societies. And if we talk about militaries going green and being more green and making and using more green techniques to create arms, I find it quite a paradox or an oxymoron, the concept of using green technologies to create weapons that are used to kill people and destroy societies. So I think, well, I don't have answers, but I feel like questioning things is very important. And so I wonder, is there room for military in a world where we search for climate justice? Should militaries be present? Should they exist? Should the current role of military, which is conflict, where should it stay the same? Should we relook at that? And I think these are questions that are worth exploring in research. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks so much, Harry. So that was super, super informative. B, I'm not too sure if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask at this moment, since we're halfway.
Well, Wanda, let's go ahead and wait until the end.
Sure.
That we can ask the panel across the board.
Sure. Sorry, I just saw something pop up. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yes, so just to put just a single facts that Raisa shared just now, the $20 trillion spend on militarized security that the US reportedly had, just a quarter of that, so about 4.5 trillion could have been used to build a fully renewable national energy grid. So that's simple action on really just like contextualizing things and really looking at them from an intersectional perspective and how to really put your money where your policies and your thoughts are. So there's just a lot to think about there. The third speaker, so thanks so much for sharing that, Raisa. That was really informative. The third speaker we have today is a Nigerian climate justice activist, organizer, director, ambassador, and student, Ibrahim Mohammed Abu Bakr. Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us. Just a little bit more about him. Ibrahim is, as I just said, a climate justice activist who's pursuing studies in geographical education. Concurrently, he is a Fridays for Future Nigeria organizer, a director of Intersectional Climate Revolutionary Action, the Nigerian chapter, and a certified SDGs ambassador. Last but not least, Ibrahim's enthusiasm to speak for Mother Earth and speak science to power made him an Arctic Base Camp Youth Climate Ambassador, which is super cool. So Ibrahim, it's awesome to have you with us today, and we're also excited to hear from you. So over to you. Thanks.
I am not seeing him on the call still. He might have gotten kicked off. So why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and switch to Manal. And then if Ibrahim is able to hop back on to the Zoom call, then we'll have him go last. Does that sound good?
All right, yes, let's do that. That's good. Yeah, can't just see them from my side. Awesome, yeah, let's do that. That sounds like a plan. Manal, it's so awesome to have you here with us. Manal is a Palestinian climate activist and Stop the War campaigns coordinator. So it's really, really awesome to have you with us. As mentioned, she's a Palestinian climate activist, grassroots organizer, and the Stop the War campaign's international advocacy officer. Currently, she's also completing her PhD at Queen Margaret University. Her thesis examines the role of Palestinian semi-nomadic women's everyday practices of resistance in reinforcing their community's sense of group solidarity and enabling them to resist Israeli settler colonial disposition in occupied West Bank. So Manal, thank you so much for having us, and over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you see my slides? Perfect.
Yes.
So hi, everyone. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, we can see them.
Great, thank you. Well, it's impossible to talk about militarization without mentioning Israel and its role in shaping the global picture of militarization while claiming to be an environmentally friendly country. So as a matter of fact, Israel is a key global supplier of advanced weaponry in different forms or kinds of weaponry across the world. And that's thanks to international or support to Israel from the global north, particularly from the United States, which started in 1949. And the United States has been supporting Israel annually with more than $3 billion that go directly to developing Israel's military. And also Israel has been constantly developing its weapons and the military industry, which is thanks to being field tested on the lives and the bodies of the Palestinians. Also, Israel has been able to develop its military industry through exporting it to the rest of the world, particularly to all over the world. To Europe, for instance, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Israel's sales of weapons to Europe has remarkably increased. Israel also relies on the global South market to sell its weapons to authoritarian regimes, to clamp down on human rights defenders, social movements, and also climate activists. And what we in Palestine experience is how Israeli military power, how it is translated into a dire reality on the ground in Palestine. I will be able to talk about the part of Palestine on which Israel has been created and how its creation has marked cutting a sustainable relationship between Palestinians and their land, and has resulted in environmental injustices that we continue to suffer from. But I'll focus particularly on the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, briefly talking about the intertwinement between Israeli apartheid settler colonialism and climate apartheid or environmental injustices, which are known the occupied territories. To start with the Gaza Strip, since 2007, Israel has been imposing a military blockade on the Gaza Strip. And during the 16 years of blockade, Israel has launched several airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. So between 2008 and 2023, Israel has killed more than 4,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, including hundreds of children, and the most recent of which was like less than 2 weeks ago, when Israel killed 33 Palestinians, including 7 children in less than a week. And the murder of people in Gaza, in every assault on Gaza Strip, is what Rob Nixon calls spectacular violence. It is the visible violence to the people, but the less visible form of violence, or what he calls slow violence, is the result of the environmental damage that has been caused by Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip and the constant attacks or regular attacks on the Gaza Strip. And Israel's slow violence in the Gaza Strip is due to the contamination of water resources. 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. And it is estimated that a quarter of the diseases in the Gaza Strip are caused by the contamination of water, along with other reasons like the pollution of air because of the attacks on the Gaza Strip and the weapons. Some of these weapons are prohibited under international law that Israel usually uses in its assaults on the Gaza Strip. And also 12% of infant deaths in the Gaza Strip are caused by the contamination of water resources. This is not to mention the fact that Israel has been contaminating the soil in the Gaza Strip through systematically spraying agricultural land in Gaza with herbicides. That's the situation in the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, the situation is not better, because since Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, from the very beginning, it has treated the West Bank as a dumping site for the waste, most polluting waste actually, both from Israel and the settlements that are built. And these settlements are built through Israel's military power, through a violent process of disposition of the Palestinians. So Israel Israeli settlements dump like more than 100 tons of waste daily in agricultural land in the West Bank, and that has led to the contamination of underground water and also to the contamination of the soil and destruction of agricultural land. Also, Israel has moved its most polluting industries to the West Bank. I'm talking about 300 factories that produce contaminating chemicals, and they are built among Palestinian communities. And research shows that there is a connection between the increasing rate of diseases like cancer and other diseases and these industries. So they are directly affecting the well-being of Palestinians and also our environment. But as part of all of that, we Palestinians resist that oppression. We resist one of the most powerful military powers in the Middle East and also in the world. And one form of resistance is the BDS movement. The BDS movement is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that was created in 2005. A few years after Israel started the construction of the apartheid wall and after a violent suppression of the Palestinian intifada or uprising. And the BDS movement is represented by the largest coalition of the Palestinian civil society. And it's created and modeled after the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And the BDS movement from the very beginning has called in the world to impose a comprehensive military embargo on Israel, because this is stemming from the belief that, and the facts on the ground actually, as I mentioned earlier, that Israel's military power and the suppression of Palestinians and also the environmental injustices caused by that are linked to the complicity of the world, like the United States and others, in strengthening the Israeli military. And currently, the BDS movement is leading 3 key campaigns to impose a military embargo on Israel. And that includes also campaigns against Israel's surveillance technology, because this is part or at the core of the Israeli military. To briefly mention these campaigns, there is a campaign which is also jointly led by Stop the Wall, the organization I work for, the campaign to stop Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems is Israel's largest manufacturer of arms. It produces weapons that are usually used against people in the Gaza Strip. For instance, in 2014, the drones manufactured by Elbit Systems killed 164 children in the Gaza Strip. There is also a campaign to boycott Israeli spyware technology, particularly Pegasus, the Pegasus spyware produced by NSO Group, which is an Israeli company, because these spyware technologies are used to suppress, as I said, human rights defenders and climate activists around the world, and were used to kill Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The last campaign is to stop G4S. G4S it has been acquired by a US-based company in 2021, and it runs a central training academy for Israeli police forces, and these police forces are tasked with the brutal suppression of Palestinians. Briefly, I want to talk about, I know I'm running out of time. I'd like to talk about another form of resistance in addition to the BDS movement, which is also a non-violent form of resistance as opposed to the violent nature of the Israeli military, is the idea of eco-sumud in Palestine. Sumud, in fact, the Palestinian culture of sumud, which in Arabic means steadfastness, refers to the persistence to stay on the land of Palestine against Israeli settler colonial disposition. And this includes adaptation to the daily difficulties of life under Israeli settler colonial rule. And eco-sumud is a term that I introduced in a chapter I wrote, a forthcoming chapter, and it describes how Palestinians, through their steadfastness, they also employ tactics and land-based knowledge to maintain an environmentally friendly and sustainable relationship with the land. I won't be able to touch on all what is mentioned in the slides. I hope that I had the time to talk about the village of Deir Balut as an example of eco-sumud. But what I wanted to highlight is that eco-sumud acts as a significant counter-narrative to Israel's greenwashing narrative, which posits Israel as an environmentalist steward to legitimize its settler colonial practices, while eco-sumud shows that Palestinians are the true carers of the land. And eco-sumud also entails that land, water, and our knowledge are to be commonly shared rather than monopolized and commodified as a luxury for the few, as multinational companies around the world do. And at the core of eco-sumud is the primacy of women's resistance and in the anti-colonial Palestinian struggle. And also, finally, practicing eco-sumud is ingrained in our belief as Palestinians that Israeli settler colonialism, apartheid, and environmental injustices are surmountable, unlike how Israel is trying to make, or the image that Israel is trying to create in our minds as being insurmountable, and that our resistance is futile, and also across the world trying to show that it's insurmountable. Eco-sumud is an example that resistance and change are possible, and and that Israel is defeated, actually. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Manal. That was incredibly insightful. There's a lot I personally would like to hear more about. But what we're going to do at the moment is we're going to just move on to our question and answer session. This session is open for all the panelists. If you would like a specific panelist or two to answer your question, please just assign a name to it, and we will move in that direction. Let's just see some of the questions. B, are there any questions on your side? Oh, not my hand popping up.
Yeah, so as our panelists have explained, we can't counter the climate crisis if we don't address the problem that is the military. And that includes actively calling out the ways in which militaries have wrongfully placed themselves as the end all be all to the solution, basically, of the climate crisis. And so I think my first question, which is, I'm just going to start off with like a banger of a question, is what do you all think that we should be doing in order to build stronger transnational global movements to tackle these like narratives that the military is putting out, but also the ways in which, as Manal explained, militaries are actively, actually, as all the panelists explained, are actively harming our communities. So my question really is, what can we do better as activists or academics to really bridge these gaps?
I'll start off just with a quick answer, because I think the answer is quite simple in the sense that this is already happening. It's been a slow progress for these movements to sort of come together. But a lot of people have known for a long time that these issues are intimately linked, that they're inseparable from each other. And at the moment, there are so many examples of organizations and individual activists and advocates working both nationally and internationally to establish these links and to campaign around these links, for instance, in national parliaments or through multilateral avenues like the UN Climate Conference. So I think a short and sweet answer is really continue this work, continue what we're doing now throughout, and really highlighting how the issues are inseparable from each other, because it makes it more easy to, for instance, debunk when the military argues, but look at like the climate, we're actually a driver of climate action, like we're on par with, an ally with climate justice movements. If you come from the peace movement, you could sort of swallow this argument whole uncritically, unless we start talking to the climate movement, who is aware of the negative environmental impacts of military activities, for instance. So it's also, for me, what's been the most strong is seeing how the knowledge exchange that has been lacking across these movements, but now as it is happening, we're creating very forceful campaigns.
Can I add to what Nico just said?
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with you, Nico. I just would like to add that it's crucial to while making connections with the different like climate groups around the world, it's important to decolonize the climate movement, because talking about Palestine, it is still like some of the groups, especially in the global north, they try to block Palestinian access to climate spaces, and also they demonize us using the claim of anti-Semitism. And I'm talking about like movements like in Germany, for instance, and while at the same time giving space for Israeli climate groups, which are and these Israeli climate groups, actually, they are a tool to greenwash Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism, because they don't draw on the connection between the climate crisis in Palestine or in Israel and Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. So it's really, as you mentioned, knowledge exchange, but also like making sure that the knowledge of those who are oppressed is centered and is validated and is accepted as something that is valid, instead of like trying to challenge our knowledge or our truth through like trying to have the perspective of the oppressor. Thank you.
Fantastic. Raisa, did you want to add anything to this particular question?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Wait, can you just say the question again? I have an answer, but I just want to.
Sure. I think the overall, like the overarching question is really like, how can we build stronger movements, or how can we do a better job of really supporting one another and, facilitating a stronger movement as a whole?
I think, well, as someone who is obviously young and doesn't have experience with working in the space, I think what we can do is just, people, and not as people who are working in spaces and know about things. I think what is so important for us to do is just, to keep asking questions and questioning things and not taking things at face value, and looking for connections, looking at ways to join the dots and questioning those dots. And I think that's really important in fighting for change, asking questions. Like in fighting, once you fight for change, you have to be able to understand that something is wrong and something needs to be changed. And I think that also leads, when you ask questions, it also sometimes leads to gaining answers from really cool people. And connecting with people is also so important, because we need to be united in the fight so that we don't leave anyone behind.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read them to the group. So this question is for Isa. Are you familiar with relevant developments in military carbon footprint of South African, and also what stance African Union has on subject matter, climate emergency, and potential greening of its own police and peacekeeping missions?
I think my answer is going to be quite short. I'm not actually familiar with that, so
no problem.
Yeah, I can't.
That's totally okay. We'll ask, there's another question from Manal, and the question is, if agricultural areas are targeted by armed forces of Israel, and if there are environmental assessments made on the status of Palestinian land, as military operations usually fill land with heavy metals and chemicals that turn land into infertile, and health hazard for any living. I'm not sure where the question is in that particular statement, but maybe if you want to speak more generally, Manal, about this sort of topic.
Of course, agricultural land, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, is the most affected by the Israeli military, because, for instance, in the West Bank, Area C of the West Bank is, which is where agricultural land is located, is under full Israeli control. And 18% of Area C is classified as either firing zone or a military training area for the Israeli military. And what we are witnessing in the West Bank is a desertification of agricultural land, because on the one hand, Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to access their land and tend their land, and also through to do military trainings, and also through the military, Israel controls more than 90% of our water resources. So our inability to access our water resources has also resulted in the desertification of agricultural land. In the Gaza Strip, as I mentioned, Israel keeps spraying agricultural land that are located in the buffer zone to the eastern border of the Gaza Strip with chemicals, with herbicides, and that has made this agricultural land in the Gaza Strip infertile, and Gaza is also witnessing a desertification of the land. There is a lot online written about this buffer zone and Israeli spraying of herbicides on the land of the Gaza Strip, so you can easily find any information about this online with the statistics as well. I hope I answered your question.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That was perfect. Nico, I have a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about how we might understand the climate crisis and the global war on terror, specifically around this notion of the everywhere war?
Specifically related to the war on terror?
More so like how we might see like similar commentary being used by Western militaries when we discuss like the fighting the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, because what we're seeing really with this green agenda is how it's not new for Western militaries to draw on certain emancipatory discourses now in order to justify their wars. And this we've seen throughout the Everywhere War, the War on Terror, where these nations go to war and embark on different kinds of military activities, which are not technically all-out wars, such as drone warfare and drone killings and mass surveillance and so on, all across the globe, under the banner of in the name of humanity, against terrorism, for the sake of civilization, in the name of democracy and human rights and so on. And so the way I view the current green agendas is really an extension of this. It's sort of the metamorphosis, the mutation of this kind of narrative in an era of climate breakdown, where these militaries, they've been aware of the need to adapt to a changing climate for way longer than the rest of society, for 2 to 3 decades even. But it's not until now, when sort of the climate issue is becoming, it's on everyone's mind, it's unavoidable, that they're also trying to adapt to pay lip service to going green, and they are to a certain extent. But it's just a way of justifying the same kinds of wars and perpetuating the same kinds of militarized responses to international insecurity that we've seen throughout these decades. Does that answer? Was that sort of what you were hinting at?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was wondering. It looks like we have a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you to all of the panelists as well as the organizers. So my question is mainly related to Nico's presentation. It's regarding like the green transition of the military. It seems like there's no legal obligation for them to do so, which also makes it possible for them to kind of lead actions whenever it's convenient for them and when it's aligned, as you said, with their military objectives. So my question is that, first of all, is there any actual international legal obligations to make the military go green? Like, for instance, publish reports on the environmental impacts of their operations or their infrastructures. And if there's none, is there anything that's coming, that's being processed? Thank you very much.
To the best of my knowledge, there is no existing legal mechanisms, neither nationally or internationally, to sort of force militaries to take care of the environment, both in peace and wartime. Which is a crazy thing. There are certain avenues, I think, internationally that we can take to hold sort of states or military actors accountable for their harm, which was attempted, I think, in the Iraq War. But then the only actor that was held accountable was the Iraq military and state for their destruction of natural habitats and so on. But the US and the UK, for instance, despite them using depleted uranium weapons and despite their what kind of warfare having long-lasting generational effects, this became a non-issue internationally. So you can see that the avenues that exist are being used with a certain bias related to everything we've been talking about today. But there are, and I have a colleague here on the call who is working currently with new legislation internationally to protect the environment during armed conflict. And I think there were some successes made in 2022 with regards to this. It's called the PERAC, Protection of the Environment During Armed Conflict. And if I've understood correctly, it's not a legal mechanism yet, but it's becoming acknowledged, at least within the UN, that this is something that we need. And I think we're moving towards a treaty. But I think Ellie Kinnig knows more about this, who's also on the call. So please, Lou, you can also ask Ellie, who's on the call. So there are stuff happening on this, but just to answer your question, is that it's just absolutely insane that there hasn't been more done on this nationally or internationally to also to make the links legally between military practice and environmental harm. No, I hope that answered some of your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Elia, just so you're texting the chat.
Fantastic. So we have another question. Manal, you talked a little bit about a woman-led campaign in Palestine. Ecosamud is what you called it. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. I know you were quite rushed towards the end. And then also if Nico and Raisa, if you have any other sort of campaigns that you've seen. I know Raisa, you talked a lot about intersectionality that you've seen that were quite successful or that you wish would have had maybe some more, a bigger spotlight on it. And Manal, if you would like to start off with Ecosamud, I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Bea. Yeah, what I wanted to say about the role of women in Ecosamud is I wanted to mention the village of Deir Balut. It is located to the northwest of the occupied West Bank, and it's near the village where I was born and grew up. And so I have firsthand experience in the village of Deir Balut and like interacting with women there. So Deir Balut is one of the villages that has witnessed a restructuring of the labor in Palestine after 1967, because Israel opened its market to thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinian men as cheap wage laborers in its corporations. And that means that Palestinian men left their land. So women took over the task or the responsibility of tending the land, and Deir Balut is an example of that. What is remarkable about the role of women in tending the land and where they were able to protect it, especially because 94% of the land in Deir Balut is classified as Area C under full Israeli control. And according to Israeli law, which is applied only to Palestinians, if Palestinians don't cultivate their land for 3 years and above, it is confiscated automatically by a military order. So these women, despite of the absence of men and despite of restrictions on them to access their land through building the apartheid wall, illegal settlements, confiscation of water resources, and also constructing a military checkpoint, they've managed to protect their land, and they used really creative ways that are also in harmony with traditional way of tending the land, like rain-fed agriculture. They used a system of agriculture and irrigation that is 1,000 years old, but at the same time they keep renewing it in a creative way. They also their role in protecting the land is marked by the flexibility and the dynamism of the crops system in the area in response to the challenges and the changing climatic, economic, and political circumstances. So women in Deir Balut and also in other parts of the West Bank are really playing a key role in what I call the Ecosamud, in the absence of men who have to work for Israeli corporations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely will be doing my fair share of research after your presentation. Nico, Raisa, do you want to talk about any campaigns or anything movement-wise that you've seen that has been a sign of progress, maybe, or even a joy-based movement that we think has a lot of potential in pushing us away from this militarized response to the climate crisis?
Should I start? I think I was just thinking about two examples, and again, that Ellie Kinney from CEOBS put in the chat, because there's a lot of work going on now to try to make sure that the UN FCCC and the IPCC, sort of the international climate mechanisms that we have, are including military emissions, because it's astounding that despite what we've said about the percentage of global emissions coming from military activity, which we can't really even count to the full extent, that there still are no legal mechanisms to ensure that states report on these emissions, or that military sectors are actually held accountable for these. So there's a lot of work going on in advocacy around the UNFCCC and advocacy nationally, specifically in the UK and across Europe and the US, to make sure that the military emissions are reported on. And I'll put some links in the chat. And otherwise, I also just had in mind, I put some links in the chat as well to climate justice organizations who are all making these connections specifically from the perspective that Banal was talking about, in which we can see that there's really no way of separating movements towards decolonization, towards demilitarization, towards decriminalization and decarbonization. That these movements are really making these links in a beautiful way. And again, centering, not saying that demilitarizing and climate action is just, it's automatically the same thing, but it has to do with the way in which we demilitarize and the way in which we go towards climate action, with an emphasis on justice, with an emphasis on indigenous communities and indigenous knowledges, for instance. So it's really, for me, it's really inspiring to see these groups that are making the kinds of links between these issues that we need to see, I think, to have a chance at moving towards a more sustainable planet, both for us and for the planet.
I just want to mic drop after every single one of our panelists talk. I'm just like, you're saying it all, you're doing the work actively, and it's so important. So grateful for you. Raisa, did you want to add anything to this point?
Yeah, so I don't think, again, I don't know much about military, but I just want to talk a bit about like South Africa's context. Yeah, South Africa doesn't, well, as far as I know, I haven't witnessed a very heavy military presence. We're not in a war context, but South Africa is very dangerous, and there's lots of crime and violence. Like, it's not war with other people, but within South Africa, within communities, there's lots of war and violence. And in fact, the only time I've actually seen the military be present, apart from I think lockdown, is when there's this area in Cape Town called the Cape Flats, and I think that is one of the most dangerous areas in the world. I always thought the Cape Flats was a block of flats, but it's not. It's a big area in flat land, which is also, well, related but not related. It's also very vulnerable to the climate crisis because it's very susceptible to flooding. But anyway, and they've sent the military in there because the violence and gangsterism is so bad. And I don't know about big organizations that are tackling things. I'm not very aware, but what I have noticed and what I've encountered is within communities, there are always little beacons of light, and there are always people in communities that want to do things for their communities. And I think that just points to the importance of grassroots, and instead of people coming from outside into communities and deciding what communities need, helping communities do what they know that they need. And even, I don't know much about organizations and movements that deal with those things, but from what I know in my context, it's humans and people who live in these situations that know what they need and that are doing things. We just don't hear about it.
Yeah, but I think that you brought up a really good point, right? We don't need these things to be big all of the time, right? We don't need movements to be big all of the time. What we need are a bunch of fires, us constantly combating, for lack of a better word, these sorts of militarization of our communities, right? Like, there are reasons why certain communities are more dangerous, and a lot of that has to do with probably colonization, right? Apartheid. And these things have direct linkages to things like the climate crisis. I am going to see it. Is there anyone else that wants to ask a question before we finish this fantastic panel? I'm going to give you like 3 seconds to get it out. All right, perfect. I just want.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was taking a really long time to put my hand up. I don't really have a question, and I'm stepping outside of the co-moderation role for a second. I just wanted to, before we wrap everything up, also just like shamelessly plug all the different like campaigns and like different like organizations that everyone's a part of, and different working groups, as Rose was speaking about, on how to just become like a more like everyday activated sort of just activists, or even just like individualistic actions across the board. So everyone throughout the panel and even in the chat comes from really, really cool places. So if you can just go on social media, even websiting, and look at, you know, Corruption Trackers work, World Peace Foundation's work, Scientists for Global Responsibility, Youth Fusions, and all the individual speakers, just like profile pages and stuff, they share so much work and so many easily accessible actions that you can take. There's also a really, really cool working group, the Arms, Military and Global Climate Justice Working Group, that deals with these intersections and deals with a lot more that we spoke about. So if you follow everyone and just engage with them, that's always a great starting point. Thanks.
I love a shameless plug. Thank you so much for that information, Alwande. And please do make sure to follow these amazing panelists. I'm sure that we will see plenty of information and actions coming out of this phenomenal group. I just wanted to do a couple of thank yous really quick. First of all, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today and took time out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedule to hear our amazing panelists. Again, I want to thank the World Peace Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York for helping us with this event. And I would like to thank, for so much thanks goes to all of the panelists who have put in time and effort to give us an opportunity to learn today. So thank you so much for coming and teaching us about the climate crisis and militarization. I hope that everyone has a great day, and remember to do your part to end the climate crisis. Bye, everyone.
Sorry, B, just one more.
Yeah, of course.
We have an evaluation form that we'll share in the chat. It will be awesome if you can just give us some feedback on how we can improve or certain things that we should continue doing. But as B said, thank you so much for coming, and we really appreciate everyone and all the speakers. Thank you.